You're listening to Project Management Paradise, the ultimate project management podcast.
Hello and welcome to Project Management Paradise. Johnny Beirne here, and this podcast delivers real project management insights from experts around the world. In this very first episode, I speak with Fergus O'Connell about how to manage the impossible project. Fergus has over 20 years' experience in project management and has written 5 books on the subject. He runs his own training and consultancy company, ETP, and has trained hundreds of people, including the organisers of the Special Olympics World Games, on his simple and effective 10-step method. In this interview, you will get some real practical tips, including 2 things you must have to ensure your projects are successful. Hello, Fergus, and welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Johnny. Thanks for asking me along.
I'm sure you have a busy schedule. You're in Italy at the moment?
I am. I live in Italy.
Just for those who may not know you, Fergus, can we just get a brief background of your history so far in the whole world of project management?
Yeah, sure. I went to UCC in Cork and I got a degree in mathematical physics. And then I started working as a techie in IT and software development. And then, I moved on to become a project manager. My last real job before I started my own company was I was running a subsidiary of a US software company in Ireland. And then in 1992, I started my own thing. My company is called ETP, and my angle on project management was that it was not the sort of very complex methodology-focused thing that many people thought it was. It just seemed to me it was common sense. And that was the way I sort of pitched it. So we're a training and consulting company specializing in project management as common sense, I think you could say.
And you have a method known as the 10 steps, is that correct?
Yeah, it is. Basically, all the time I was working as a techie and as a project manager, I suppose I was trying to get a sense of why do some projects succeed and others fail. And I guess the 10 steps is sort of derived from that analysis, I guess, really trying to harness the things that seem to make for good projects and reduce the effect of the things that make for bad projects. And that's really where it came from. So, I don't really think of it as a methodology. It's just more a method derived from observing things that happen, really.
Right. And then it was used by the Special Olympics World Games back in 2003.
Yeah. Between 2000 and 2003, we were the project management consultants for the Special Olympics World Games. And I think it was a kind of a happy marriage, really, because lots of the people there who were running parts of that project weren't career project managers. They were people who'd maybe given up a year of their job to volunteer to do this work. And so what they needed was a very quick immersion in something that would get them up and running. They didn't really want big, heavy-duty methodologies, and our method just seemed to fit fine for that. So we trained a couple of hundred people there, and off they went. And, I think it's generally regarded as a pretty successful project.
Oh, absolutely. It must be a really, easy method to adopt when you're saying that it was volunteers that, successfully ran the games using your methodology, or using the 10-step method, I should say.
Yeah, it's really easy. My feeling is that most people are project managers anyway, and then when we do things in our own lives, like we plan a house move or a wedding or a holiday or something like that, we do lots of the things that make for good project management. So we'll make out lists of things that have to be done. We'll hand out jobs to people. We'll have contingency in a plan. We may not think of it in those terms. We may not get a flip chart out in the kitchen with our wife or husband-to-be and say, let's plan the wedding, and type it into Microsoft Project. But I think many of us instinctively do project management anyway. And usually when I teach this method to people, firstly, it only takes a couple of days to get it across to them and have them try it out. And they find it really easy to adopt because in some ways it just gives them a structure within which to do many of the things they've already been doing anyway.
And did you take up a formal project management role after graduation, or did you go straight into forming your own company?
Well, no, after graduation I just worked as a techie. I had a series of jobs. I worked in Ireland, I worked in the States, I worked in Australia. And then somewhere along there, a lot of techies make the transition from sort of techie to maybe team leader to project manager, and that was my kind of transition as well. And then eventually I moved on to sort of more general management. So I think that's a fairly standard kind of career progression for people who go through that, you know.
The question then is, can you remember or what was your first project management role formally?
I can remember my first failed project. I worked on a project in Australia. It was to develop a system for a shipping line to track vessels and containers, and it was a complete catastrophe. Now, I was only a techie on this project. I wasn't involved in managing it, but I think it was that one got me interested in why had the project gone so horribly wrong, and it went wrong for a couple of reasons. One was that there were two leaders on it. One was sort of the official leader, the nominal leader, but there was also a guy with a very strong personality who became the sort of the real leader, if you like, and basically two different projects broke out, some people sort of reporting to the nominal leader and some people reporting to the real leader. And the project headed off in two different directions, really. And eventually the management sort of figured it out and there was a bit of a bloodletting. But that, I think that was what got me interested in this whole area, was why had it gone wrong.
And was there a particular methodology being used? I know there was probably two when it went two different ways, but do you remember any?
Yeah, there wasn't really. I think both project managers were just flying by the seat of their pants, really. Like, to be honest, I've never been involved in a project that used one of these heavy-duty methodologies. It's always been, you know, if I was working under other people, they were just doing it whatever way they picked it up along the way. And when I started to do it myself, I was doing much the same thing, except that I was also trying to understand more generally why did some of the things I do work and why did some of them not work. And I mean, that was a long and fairly tortuous process, but eventually I got to the point where it seemed that I'd kind of figured it out, really. I don't mean I have all the answers, but I seem to have a method that worked in most cases, and that's sort of been what I built my business on then, really.
And you've written 15 books to date, including 5 project management.
Yeah. Well, you know, firstly, I like writing. I mean, I have this alternative life as a novelist anyway, so I suppose that's the main reason I wrote them. But I mean, I like to put this information out there because I think it can be a help to people. You know, I'm not trying to say that I'm trying to change the world or make the world a better place or anything, but I think, you know, a lot of very bad things happen on projects. I mean, not just wasted money, but wasted time, wasted resources, you know, careers screwed up, unhappy people, stressed people. And I guess if my books can sort of help with that and spread the word a little bit wider, then, you know, that's no bad thing, really. But I wouldn't want you to get the impression that I'm trying to be a saint or anything like that.
No, that's okay. The book we're going to look at today or focus on is, well, the topic is how to manage the impossible project, but there's some specific great material in the book, Leadership Lessons from the Race to the South Pole. Can you tell us a little bit of background of where the inspiration came for that one?
Yeah, the race to be first at the South Pole in 1912 between Scott and Amundsen, it's a reasonably well-known story. But from the point of view of a management case study, it's really quite extraordinary and quite unique because you have one project, exactly the same project, being carried out by two separate teams. One, I don't think I'm giving too much away if I say this, Amundsen's team, the Norwegian guy, is spectacularly successful. They get to the South Pole first and they get back safely. And then the other team, the British team led by Robert Scott, they get there second, obviously, and they all die on the return journey. So you have one team spectacularly successful, the other team a dismal failure. And what's even more interesting then is that both projects are documented because Amundsen wrote a book when he came back from the South Pole called The South Pole, and then Scott's diaries were found after his death. So you have an account in each of those things of the project, and so you can learn astonishing things from how each of them went about it and how their efforts were so different and why one succeeded so well and why the other went so badly wrong. And in fact, a lot of that is material that's gone into my method, you know, into the 10 steps.
Is there one or two contrasting things that they did?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, there are a number of things. There are quite a few, but I mean, the two most obvious ones are, the first one is focus. So Amundsen had just one goal. I mean, he wanted to get to the South Pole and he wanted to get his people back safely. And that second part of the goal, you know, get the people back safely. I mean, he was as conscious of that as he was about getting there. So he had a very clearly defined goal. Now, Scott, by comparison, he wanted to get to the pole, but he also was leading a scientific expedition, and he had scientists on his expedition who were going to study the weather, they were going to study geology, they were going to study the wildlife, all kinds of things. And so Scott's goal was much more diffuse and much more unclear, really. And so you had the ridiculous situation that when he was returning from the pole, and he was starting to get into very serious trouble because his people were weakening, they had scurvy, they didn't have enough food. He stopped one day to collect rocks, like geological samples. And this was at a time when one of his people especially was very seriously ill. And, you know, if you look at that from Amundsen's point of view, he would have regarded it as like outrageous, bordering on criminal negligence. But from Scott's point of view, it made complete sense given the kind of fluffy nature of his goal. So that's one thing. And then the second thing is just attention to detail. One of the things that strikes you constantly when you read Amundsen's book is the meticulous care he took in everything, really, in the equipment he was going to use, in the planning, all that kind of stuff. And Scott was much less, maybe competent is the right word. Yeah, much less competent in terms of his planning. So those two things, like focus and attention to detail, I think a lot of the success or failure of a project is down to those two things, really. You know, clearly defining the goal and then figuring out as best you can and as accurately as you can and in as much detail as you can what has to be done to achieve the goal.
Okay. Was the collecting of the rocks then, was that additional requirements for the project along the way, do you think, or should it never have been put in? I mean, it's back to the impossible project. Was he starting to make the project impossible along the way, do you think, on the way back, or was it just clearly not defined?
Yeah, I think you can look at it both ways. You can say it wasn't clearly defined. You can also say it was impossible, that he was just trying to do too much given the limited resources he had. And that if he had, what he could have done was had two separate projects. One which was to get to the pole and back and, have a team to work on that. And then a separate project to do the scientific stuff. And have a team to work on that with its own goals and targets. But the two things were sort of so mixed up together that you had then the situation where, one sort of impinged on the other in a very negative way. But that happened repeatedly throughout his expedition.
So that brings us on then to the whole idea of the impossible project and the project stakeholders' expectations and the difference between a pro and an amateur in terms of managing those expectations, and I guess fundamentally being able to say no, which is something that you focused on in a bit of detail.
Yeah, it seems to me from what I've learned over the last few years, well, the last 20 odd years really, of, doing consulting and training with project managers, is that the number one reason our projects fail, and when I say our projects, I mean high-tech projects in knowledge-based industries. It seems to me the number one reason they fail is they were never actually possible in the first place. Like some boss or stakeholder just said, it has to be done by this date or for this budget or with these resources, and everybody just said sure. And it's a situation which would never happen in another industry. For example, if you take your car to the garage and say to the guy in the garage, I don't know what's wrong with my car, but I need you to fix it in the next hour, and I'll give you €50. He's not going to agree to that. He's not going to say sure. Instead, he's going to say, look, I'll have a look at your car, and then I'll tell you what the possibilities are. And that same approach this is what I teach anyway, it's what we should do in our high-tech and knowledge-based projects. The stakeholders or the customers or the bosses have certain requirements. They do have budget limitations and date constraints and all that kind of stuff. But we also have constraints as project managers, which is that we can't agree to something that's clearly impossible. And so the basis of the 10 steps really is to say, look, we're not going to say sure, that's the first thing. The second thing is we're going to have a look at the project, just as a mechanic would look at a car in a garage or a doctor would look at a patient in a surgery. And then we'll say, look, here's what's possible and here's what's not possible.
Do people feel a fear then that if they don't say sure, that then, worst case scenario, their job is on the line?
Well, I think they do. I think that their careers will be retarded in some way. Their jobs may be on the line, especially during the recession over the last 5 or 6 years. I've had people tell me that they were told they were lucky to have a job, stuff like that. But I think it's important to say it's not about saying no. I think that puts the emphasis in the wrong place. We're saying no that a particular project can't be done, but we still have to solve the stakeholders' problems. So we have to figure out ways to achieve, to come close to what they're looking for. So as project managers, we have basically 4 parameters we can work with. One is the scope of the project, one is the deadline, one is the amount of resources we're going to put into it, and one is the quality of what's being delivered. And by varying those 4 parameters, we can come up with other possible projects which would still solve the bulk of the stakeholders' problem, but would also solve our problem as project managers, that, we need to have a project that has some chance of succeeding, as opposed to a project that never had any chance of succeeding.
Better to achieve a certain amount than fail the entire thing.
Yeah, well, I know nobody whose career has been damaged in any way by doing what I'm talking about. But I know loads of people whose career has been damaged by, agreeing to something that was impossible and then, finding out down the line that actually that was the case.
And in terms of a successful project then, apart from, on budget and meeting all the requirements, what else would you, put into your definition of a successful project? Well,
what I teach to people is that, of course, it's about on budget and within the deadline and stuff like that. But I say to people that if you want it in 2 words, a successful project is happy stakeholders. In other words, you tell them what they're going to get from the project, and that's what they get.
So back to managing expectations.
Exactly, yeah. And, part of that, a kind of a corollary of that is to say, well, look, this is what you're going to get, but actually, this other thing that you may have wanted, you're not actually going to get that because it's not actually possible, But I think the other important thing is you've got to show why it's impossible. You can't just say, I feel it in my guts or something like that. You have to prove it to them. And that's where planning and estimation comes in, that by accurately estimating the project, the amount of work to be done, and then by figuring out what resources are available, you can see what's achievable and what's not achievable. But most, to be fair to bosses and stakeholders and customers, most project managers don't do that, and then it means they give the customer or the stakeholder nothing to work with, really. If you say to me the project can't be done, then if I'm your boss, my only kind of alternative is to put pressure on you, really. I have no other tool to work with,
So that's one of the important skills then, is kind of managing expectations and negotiating on the requirements. Are there any other skills you've seen that are probably age-old or have changed over the years, but in today's project management world, what are a couple of, maybe 2 or 3 of the essential or effective skills every project manager should have?
Yeah, the other 2 that I think are kind of important, and they're both related to that really, are, one is attention to detail. The best project managers I've come across, and in fact, again, Amundsen was an example of that, like massive attention to detail, because the expression, the devil is in the detail, and often it is, like it's small things can undo you. So that's one. And the other is good communicators, because I think, if a successful project is happy stakeholders, then we have to keep the stakeholders in the loop all the time that the project is unfolding. We have to set their expectations at the beginning, and then as the project unfolds, keep them in the loop as to how those expectations are going. And, if we do that, even if the project went horribly wrong from the point of view of the estimates and the actuals and stuff like that, we might still be able to retrieve happy stakeholders from a bit of a disaster, really, if we were just kind of upfront with them, really, But many project managers aren't. They kind of, if there's bad news brewing, they kind of keep it under their hat to the last moment. And generally, by the time anyone finds out about it, it's far too late, and it's much more expensive than had it been dealt with earlier on.
Yeah, and in terms of changes coming down the tracks then, Fergus, do you predict any major or exciting new things in project management in the next 3 to 5 years? Well,
kind of yes and no. Here are the things I've observed. Certainly our business, like in terms of project management as common sense, that seems to be taking more of a hold. Like more people seem interested in that. We've had lots of people who've tried the big heavy-duty methodologies saying, well, that didn't really add a great deal of value. We'll try your thing instead. So that's one thing. But of course, I suppose I would say that, wouldn't I? But the other thing that staggers me really is how little has changed, say, since we went into business in 1992, that people are making the same mistakes now that they were making 25 years ago, and I find that astonishing, really. And I guess the third thing I've noticed is that how lots of organizations that you would never have thought of as being project managers have suddenly become project management focused. I'm thinking particularly of not-for-profit organizations, charities, people like that, Like 20 years ago, we would never have seen one of those on our courses, but now they routinely come on them. And they're all talking the language of business. They talk about projects, they talk about competitors, in other words, the other charities that are competing for, the limited pot of money that's out there. And that's been very interesting.
Well, look, Fergus, it's been a pleasure. We're really grateful for you to take the time to join us. I'm sure we'll have you back on the Project Management Paradise podcast. Some really, really useful insights. We'll be making all the information available in the show notes on our website and here in the show notes with links to your books as well. So from us, thanks a million for joining us.
And thank you, Johnny. It was a real pleasure to be talking with you.
Well, what about that for a first episode? You can get all the details about Fergus, his websites, links to his books in the show notes at projectmanagementparadise.com/1. We'd also love to hear an honest review and welcome feedback about this podcast at the same address. That's projectmanagementparadise.com/1. So thanks again for listening, and tune in again next week for another great guest.
Thanks for listening to the Project Management Paradise podcast at projectmanagementparadise.com.